of Laboratory for Comparative Social Research at the High School of Economics, and we are proud today to have Pippa Norris, who is a world-renowned political scientist working in both Harvard University in the United States and the University of Sydney in Australia, where she's originally from.
I'm from Britain, not Australia.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
What's a British?
Pippa is known for her research in electoral integrity. She also did some research in gender studies and religion, and her research has been recognized by prestigious awards such as Karl Deutsch Prize and Johann Schulte Prize. I think this is correct. And I guess if Nobel Prize was awarded to political scientists, she would have been a Nobel Prize winner now. Today she is going to present a lecture talking about her research on electoral integrity. And I guess without further ado, I'll give the floor to Pippa Norris.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. But I do have a British accent, not an Australian one, if you can detect the difference. And it's nice to contact also our colleagues in St. Petersburg. So I, as Edward said, work on a number of different topics. But my most recent project is one which is a large-scale 5-year project funded by the Australian Research Council on electoral integrity. And so I'm going to talk today about some of this work, and it's going to be ranging about when elections fail, when they're flawed, what might be the consequences, and what are the causes. And it's work which first we'll think about. There are 3 books which are at the heart of this. They're a trilogy for Cambridge. 2 of them have come out, the last one is still in progress. I'll talk about the concept, because the concept of electoral integrity is one everybody nods and says, yes, it's important. Nobody knows what it means. It's quite vague, but it's a very useful and legitimate way of thinking about when elections have problems. What's the quality of the contests? So I'll try and define it. And then I'll talk about our measure. And we think about how we're going to measure this for the first time. Again, we've been measuring all sorts of things for many, many years. Democracy, we've got long-standing trends, things like Freedom House, polity. Issues of human rights we're measuring. Nobody's really bothered so far to measure the quality of elections. So we provide a measure based on expert surveys. Just like when you measure corruption, we now all use Transparency International's corruption index, so we've created the Electoral Integrity Index with many different dimensions. And we've done this at country level after every election. It's a rolling survey. We're covering about 157 elections, 123 countries so far, but we're also doing it in regional and local elections in some countries, including Russia. I'll then talk about some of the explanations for why elections might be problems. And if we have time, I'll focus on 3 explanations. So when an election is not working well, it could have problems in electoral law, it could have problems in the boundaries, it could have problems in the opposition parties not being able to stand, or it could have problems in electoral violence or corruption. What are the explanations? I'm going to think about 3 today, one of which is maybe countries which are highly globalized, part of the global communications networks. Maybe those are the ones which have adopted global norms about how elections should work. So that might be one explanation. Second explanation, particularly when you think about countries in Africa or Asia, in developing countries, it might be that what matters is the technical aid and assistance which the international community gives to try and improve elections, like election officials, like improving registration processes, like improving the security of the ballot. So it might be that attempts at strengthening elections through technical assistance from the international community could really be important for when an election succeeds or when it fails. And the third explanation, which I'll consider today, is electoral observer missions. There's almost no election around the world now where election observers don't attend to deter manipulation and to try and make sure the quality meets international standards. So that's the third explanation. I'll think about some evidence and then just touch on the next steps of where this project is going. So, what's the project about? Well, we started this in 2012, and my vision for the project was one which always had three questions at the heart. The first one, how do we know when an election is flawed? How do we know what that standard might be? What are our criteria? What are our concepts? Are they universal, or are they very culturally specific? So different countries might have different views. And so first thing is, when do elections meet international standards? The second thing is, when they are failing to meet those standards for whatever reason, why does it matter? Does it matter, for example, for confidence in parties and parliaments, for how far people trust the electoral process, for how far they feel that they can trust democracy, if this is their main experience, for how they turn out and vote, whether they demonstrate peacefully, whether there are violence and there are protests, or even whether there's regime change and electoral revolutions. So what happens? And then lastly, the policy question, because I come from a policy school, what do we do? How do we try and improve electoral qualities? And we all know that elections aren't sufficient for democracy, but we also know that many countries have been destabilised because the election's gone wrong for one reason or another, and then some really quite fragile states have fallen back. So we need to think, when we're spending quite a lot of money on this now, what's the most effective way that we can work? Whether it's, for example, the United Nations, or some of the international NGOs, or others within countries who want to support better quality elections. So a long-term project, generously funded, and everything is at electoralintegrityproject.com, so if you want to find out anything further, that's where it's about. This is our website, just to give you the little illustration. We have a team based in Sydney, as well as at Harvard. We have interns, so we have a number of visitors, we have senior researchers, we have a number of different workshops and panels. We've just announced 3 new workshops, one at IPSA in Turkey, in Istanbul in July, one in APSA, American Political Science Association in Philadelphia, and one in Prague at the ECPR. So those are all coming forward. We've just issued the call for papers. So, and we give out our data. As soon as we collect it, every 6 months it's available. So any graduate who wants to work in this field, there's an awful lot who are really taking this up, can pick up the data and work on their own country, or can work on a particular issue, and can really take this field forward. These are the 3 books which are the core, which I've been working on. The first one is the question about why does it matter? So that's where I'm using the World Values Survey, where we have a battery of items, and we've asked people in many, many countries some basic questions. Do you agree, disagree? For example, rich people buy elections. Electoral officials are fair. Journalists provide fair coverage. There's 9 different items, and from that you can tell how the general public in many countries feels about the quality of their elections, and then does it affect their attitudes and their values? Does it affect their behaviour? Second one was just come out in a few months ago. That's why elections fail, so that's explaining it. And you can think of it that in the first book we were taking electoral integrity as the independent variable, with many different factors of political behaviour as the dependent. In the second book, in some ways I've reversed this. So my measure of electoral integrity, I'm trying to explain. What explains the variety of places which have elections according to our index, which are pretty good, and those which are really problematic. Then the last book, which is the one I'm still working on, is the one on what do we do? What is to be done? That's a suitable phrase for Russia. What is to be done? So this is the first book, and I'm not going to talk about this today, but you can see how it's structured in terms of the consequences, and they're just basic classic issues in political sociology. Legitimacy, how do you get your ideas of legitimacy? How do you behave as a result of that? This is the book where I'll give you a little bit of a snapshot of some of the evidence, and this is the second volume, Why They Fail. And again, I'm not going to cover every single explanation. I'm going to focus on one chapter to give you a sense of what it's about, and that's the role of international forces. And then we'll talk about how we measure this and what the concepts are. So, electoral integrity. Let's start with the idea. And I can give you some examples, and that really drives it home in many, many ways. If you think about countries around the world and what's been going on with elections. Take the case of Thailand in February 2014. It was a country which was thought to be an emerging economy. It was moving along and was also seen to be fairly democratic. It had an opposition, it had a government, there was rotation, there was freedom of speech, and it was a country which was seen as progressing in many ways in the region. But deep divisions in the country between the rural and the urban, between the reds and the yellows, diverse groups based on personalities but also different social identities. As a result, there were violent street demonstrations. And in 10% of the districts where there were meant to be polls, people couldn't actually open up the polling districts. The others all voted, but afterwards, immediately, there were further violence and problems on the street, legal challenges. The Constitutional Court said if you've got an election with 10% of the polling stations not open, that's not legal, that's not constitutional. The Prime Minister fell, there was a military coup d'etat. And right now, although again, the military is saying there's going to be new elections, there's no date, and the country is being deeply divided as a result of this experience and moved back in terms of any form of democratization, with important consequences for investment as well and economic development. Afghanistan, the elections there have always been problematic. 2004, the first election where there were really open contests, Hamid Karzai stood, but it was really run by the international community. There were problems, but it wasn't so bad in the sense there was a credible result, meaning Hamid Karzai seemed to have enough ahead of the opposition to form a credible presidency. 2009, it got worse, and there were worse cases of corruption, voter bribery, intimidation. 2014, the opposition candidate in the first ballot thought he was going to win, and he seemed to be coming second. Immediately, there was contests, and both sides said they're going to bring their supporters out on the streets. As a result, there were claims of fraud on an industrial scale. The United Nations stepped in. They counted every single one of the ballots, 8 million votes. But even if you count every ballot, you can't know whether or not there's still been some fraud, ballot stuffing, corruption. You can't tell that by looking at the ballots. In the end, the international community intervened, and there was a power sharing arrangement. The election essentially was thrown out. Nobody bothered with it, even though people had actually risked their lives to vote. But they came to an agreement, and peace kind of prevailed, but really the election was a failure. And Burundi, the latest one, where in many, many African countries, the problem is strongmen leaders who have been in power for 2 terms, and a 2-term constitutional limit, and in each case they've tried to push and say, well, I wasn't really there for two terms. It happened in Senegal, it happened in Burundi. Great instability, with problems for the border region around Rwanda, around Burundi, 50,000 refugees, etc. So each of these cases, I think, are clear cases of failure. We've had elections, but they really haven't worked. But we're not simply talking about developing countries. We're not simply talking about fragile states. We're not simply talking about countries over there. We're also talking about flaws which are universal. I only need to say to you one word, which is Florida, and everybody knows the problems in the United States. And the problems since 2000 have got worse, not better. The lawyers, the contests, the ways in which the states have tried to manipulate and change the laws has been dramatic. And indeed, the deregulation of campaign funding is a basic problem in American elections, where so much money runs the contest. Canada of all places, passed a Fair Elections Act, which in some ways stopped some younger people, some students from voting, because they improved the forms of voter identity and various other things. The United Kingdom managed to lose, has problems with ballot boxes, and Western Australia lost some ballot boxes off the side of a lorry. I mean, literally, they just fell off the side of a lorry. So elections can go wrong, even in countries which have been democratic for hundreds of years. So what do they have in common? So here's the concept that we're working with. The concept of electoral integrity, which I'm using, isn't based on a theory of democracy. It's not based on Robert Dahl. It's not based on our ideas from liberal political theory. Electoral integrity refers to the international commitments and the global agreements which countries have signed on to, right the way from 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which protects things like a secret ballot, universal franchise, and a variety of other requirements. So it's the conventions, the treaties, the protocols and the guidelines which have been agreed and which countries have said should be the criteria for running effective elections with integrity. And they're universal. They apply to every country that signs on. So they apply to Egypt as much as they apply to the United Kingdom. They apply throughout the electoral cycle. We're not just talking about problems on election day, because we know that in many countries the problems occur much earlier. They might be about electoral law. They might be about gerrymandering. If you look at a case like Malaysia or Singapore, the problem is that the opposition can hardly win. So the government can get 40% of the votes and 60% of the seats. They occur during the campaign. Do you have a level playing field in access to the media, especially broadcasting? And do you have a level access in terms of money? And they occur on polling day and in its aftermath. In some cases, the problem is not what happens on the polling day, but immediately afterwards, a community creates real violence and it descends into chaos. And electoral malpractices are everything other than that. So what's the advantages of basing it on this concept? Really, it's about legitimacy. You can go into a country, and it's not about the West telling other countries how to run elections, certainly not about America telling other countries how to run elections, or Harvard telling other countries how to run elections. It's about the things which the country itself has said are the standards that should be followed in the international community. So it has a lot of buy-in. And I can go to any country. For example, I was speaking in Vietnam, and I was speaking at the Ho Chi Minh Institute, and that's the heart of the Communist Party intelligentsia. And I could talk about this, and they could say, yes, there are some things that we need to do to improve our elections. Should we have primaries for our candidates? That's a radical idea for Vietnam. How do we get rid of corruption? So we can find ways to work with every country on these kind of principles. So then you can break it down, and you can say that there are 11 steps which need to be followed. So electoral integrity, as we said, can break down at any of these stages. Think of it like a chain. Andreas Schedler talked about 5 steps, and we define it in terms of 11 steps. So it could be your district boundaries, or your voter registration processes, is it accurate? Or it could be who gets onto the ballot, or campaign money, or the vote count, or the results, or the electoral management body. Any of those steps, each of them are equal, and all you need is one step to go wrong, and the electoral integrity is problematic. So how do you start to measure this? Well, you can't measure it directly. There is no measure of what you might term an objective measure of the quality of elections. So you might think maybe turnout, but no, you can have good turnout, high turnout, in a country where the population has been taken to the polls or threatened to go to the polls, and you can have very low turnout, classically in India, in a country which has had pretty good elections. So there is no objective measure. So what you have to do is measure it through experts. And what we measure is perceptions of electoral integrity. That's what we always call it, just like you call it perceptions of corruption. And perceptions are how experts judge a particular situation. And we're using it all the time now. For example, the new project you've probably heard of, which is VDEM, Varieties of Democracy, is again trying to have 400 different indicators with lots of experts around the world. So, how do we evaluate the perceptions? What we do is we cover all presidential and parliamentary elections at national level on a rolling basis since we started in mid-2012. We don't go back. VDEM goes right back to 1900. I don't think you can do that. But I do think after each contest, you can go to a group of experts and you can give them some basic questions, not too technical, and ask them to judge the quality of the election. The only countries we exclude are the micro-states, because we just don't have the experts. So we have a population threshold, but this still means we cover something like 175 countries around all nation-states around the world. We have 9,000 experts in our database, and some of you may well have filled this out, because we're asking people all over the place to cover these elections. We currently cover, our version is PEI 3.5, 127 countries, but we'll have another release at the end of the year, etc., etc. So eventually we'll cover everybody. It happens 1 month after each election, and We also are doing these sub-national comparisons, so we can just compare within a country. So obviously Russia is so diverse, India is so diverse, that you want to be able to look at different provinces, different states, and so we're doing that as well. Similarly, the United States. And all of our data, to emphasize, is available. If anybody wants to pull it down and use it, multi-level analysis, it's perfect for that sort of thing. So who's an expert? Well, I often get problems whenever I give this in a practitioner audience, but basically it's one of us. So it's a social scientist. Why social scientists? Because we hope that they are more independent than, for example, electoral officials, or journalists, or other experts. And we look for people around the world. We're looking for 40 people per country, 40 experts. We're looking for both domestic and international. We try to go half and half, so it would be half Russian, half international. And when we find our experts who are political scientists, we verify them. We check, have you published in this field? Have you published in elections? Are you an expert in the country? And do you have university employment? So it's a bit of a cross-check about their backgrounds. And we ask them a lot of different things. Our response rate is about 30%, which has been fairly steady ever since we started. So what do we ask? Well, I hope you've all got the handout. And what you've got is the questions that we ask of our experts, and they're all agree, disagree on 5-point scales, from strongly to strongly, down to dark. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative, but you can see the sort of thing we're looking at. And so we're asking people in your country, would you agree or disagree, such as elections were well managed, some citizens were not listed on the register, the electoral register was inaccurate, etc., etc. In each area, we're asking 2 or 3 questions to make it reliable. You can't just rely on one. And what we can do with this is that we can add all of these up, and we can then end up with a 100-point index of electoral integrity. But even more useful, we can also provide indices for each country on, for example, voter registration. Or you can even look at a specific item. So, for example, there's very little you can do if you want to look at gerrymandering around the world. You can just look at that question. If you want to look at ethnic minority representation, you can just look at that question. So we don't think you should only have a 100-point index. We really want disaggregated data, and if you want to put it together again in another way, you can do that. If you don't like my concept, that's fine. Put it together in the way that you think you want to measure electoral integrity. We're very transparent in our methods. We put everything up there, and we really encourage people to use our data, but also to critique it and to test it and find other forms of validity measures externally and internally, etc. We also, by the way, do ask our experts lots of other things. For example, where do you put yourself on an ideological scale? What's your education? What's your age? What's your background? And we want to test whether those things make a difference to their judgments. By and large, they don't. It does appear fairly robust. And it's well correlated with other indicators, for example, of democracy and of other indicators of elections. So we think we've got a fairly robust measure. So, what do we find? Well, first, here is our map, and we can do this with both the handout, where we've broken it down by region, and the map of the world. And the map, as you can see, breaks it down from the average, the mean, to those countries which are very high, those countries which are very low, using the traffic light symbols, and then some countries, of course, which we haven't yet covered, Russia, of course, because the election occurred after we started, so we'll be there for the 2018 and 2017 Duma elections. Canada's just come in, Britain's just come in, etc., etc. But we've got some countries which have never got elections, only about 5 around the world, but a lot of others which haven't yet come in from the period. Before I go on, I'm going to ask you all this. Have a look at this pattern. Do you find any patterns and countries which you think are anomalies, which are not behaving in the way which you might have expected? Do you find any countries which are more or less as you expect? And if you want to look a little further, again, I encourage you to look at the second page of your handout, because that gives you the regional comparisons, which are pretty good, so you can see quite easily across, for example, Central and Eastern Europe, Estonia doing really well, Belarus not so much. But are there cases which, when you look at the map, surprise you?
Mongolia looks unexpectedly good.
Mongolia, is it? Unexpected. Well, not unexpected actually. It's pretty good.
North Korea.
North Korea.
This is incredible.
That's right. And Cuba.
I didn't notice that.
Yes.
Cuba. We don't include only party competition, we include any election. So both Cuba and North Korea come out, it's doing it on its own, it shouldn't do that, come back. Both of those come out quite remarkably well. Now again, you have to say, what are we measuring? So for us, we're not just measuring democracy, we're measuring democratic governance. In other words, think about Cuba, and Cuba in particular I think is plausible. North Korea is more problematic, but Cuba is a one-party state, clearly. But there is local participation in the candidates. They come up from the grassroots. There's debates about which candidates they should have. There's very little corruption on vote buying. There's very little intimidation. High levels of turnout, a good register. The state wants people to vote, and it gets the process right. So essentially, they have got a good grade according to our experts. We don't adjust our experts. We don't say, well, I don't believe that. We go with what the experts say. And then we also break it down to see, is it plausible? For example, is there other evidence that that might be a good result? If I look at an observer report, if I look at the region, if I look at a series of elections, is it consistent? What else jumps out? We'll emphasise some of them, which are a bit strange. Other countries which aren't as you might expect?
But what with North Korea? Well, what about North Korea?
North Korea, I think, is a similar case. In other words, where you have an autocracy which is basically a one-party state, but doesn't have to use other forms of voter bribery, can run a very efficient and effective governance side on the election. The polling stations were open on time. The register is accurate. People are on it. So you've got these two dimensions. And in some countries like Mali, you have democracy, which is starting, but very little weak capacity. So in those countries, all sorts of things go wrong, much like the Thai example, and they can become totally destabilised as a result of those technical errors in how you run an election. In other countries, you've got a lack of human rights. So that's another basic problem. So it's the two different dimensions can equally pull down the quality of your elections. And what we find, by the way, is that it's not the countries which are more autocratic which create the most conflict, it's the countries which are the hybrid states, which have the highest level of protest, the highest level of contestation, the highest level of potential instability, before you eventually become a democracy again. So it's that middle category who have the most problematic elections. Obviously in North Korea and Cuba you do not demonstrate, you do not have boycotts, you do not have protests, because for good reasons, like you don't in Belarus as well. So a range of issues. Let's go back to the map. I'm sorry that my machine keeps on doing its own thing. Go back, stay put, stop. Other examples, because there are a couple of other cases you really need to spot, which might not be what you expect.
The US?
The United
South
States.
America.
South America.
Yes.
South America's doing much better than the United States and Mexico.
Yes.
Now, Uruguay, yes, little Uruguay is the Switzerland of Latin America. Things do work there. That's not a problem. Brazil, but of course we do have a problem with Venezuela, but nevertheless Argentina, etc. So elections in Latin America, I think, do work fairly well, except for problems of corruption, and in particular in Central America, problems of drug cartels, which are really creating such violence now in Mexico. It's a fundamental issue. So particular countries have those problems. But we know that there's also a regular series, and the United States is essentially moderate. It is the worst of all the democracies, all the established democracies, and it's not just one election where the experts score it worst. We've gone to them in 2012, 2014, and in both cases they've come out right at the bottom of the democratic states. And again, you have to say, is that plausible? And I think it is. Somebody who lives in America, living through this current election, which is going on and on. And there's all sorts of flaws and problems in American elections. They're highly partisan, they're highly localized, which means that there's no standardization across the country. Registration processes vary from one state to another, and the Republican states are making it much more difficult to vote, while Democratic states are making it more convenient to vote. But in either case, it's highly partisan in the way which it shouldn't be. So, as you can see, and again, look at this as well. Which are the countries, for example, in Central and Eastern Europe, which come out well? Lithuania was our #1 country in 2014. What does that say? that you can be, the good news, you can be a middle-income country, but you can still, essentially, a fairly new democracy, and you can still do quite well. Estonia, Slovenia, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, all countries which have had, of course, elections for decades. They've only moved towards competitive elections more recently, but they had an effective state. They knew how to do the public administration 101, and in those countries, they come out really remarkably well. Other countries in the region, Hungary, we know, is moving backwards in terms of some political rights, particularly with the Conservative administration. But also, as we can see, it goes down in Kazakhstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and again, we can all argue. If you just look down that Central and Eastern European list, Edward, does that make sense, roughly, to you? More or less? If you didn't see this and you were trying to just say, how would I rank elections in the region?
I don't know why Moldova is so much higher up than Romania.
Right. So here what you need to do is we need to go beyond the aggregate figure. A 100-point index doesn't tell you a lot about what the problem is. So what we do is we do this. We say, let's create 100-point indices which are there for each of the different 11 stages. So immediately we can say, in the United States, what's the weakness? And it turns out to be the boundaries, which are highly gerrymandered. They're basically run by the parties, and the parties create districts in order to reinforce their majorities. So they're very weak. They're weak on voter registration, and they're weak on campaign finance. Is that plausible? Absolutely. On the other hand, are there problems about the vote count? No, not really. That isn't where things happen in America. So you can go down each country, and in our full report, which I would encourage you to pull down, we can look at the particular weaknesses or the particular strengths which are there in each of the different stages of the electoral cycle. I didn't put all the countries on this graph because otherwise you can't read it. But again, look down the columns, and a couple of things jump out. Which is the weakest stage of the electoral cycle in general across most countries? Campaign finance. Money and media. And the reason, quite simply, is that there is no convention, almost no convention, which is international on the role of money in politics. Different countries use different processes, have different regulations. Some of them require transparency, some of them have donor caps, some of them have spending caps, and some of them have public funding. But often, even if you have laws in theory, in practice we know that money runs through politics, through corruption, clientelism, and vote buying. And because of this, we actually have written also a new report on money in politics, and it's going to be a new book for Oxford University Press. It's an edited book, and we have Russia as one of our case studies, along with a wide range of other countries like South Africa, India, Sweden, etc. And Russia emerged as a classic case of a country with regulations on paper look really good, but in practice, problems of money in politics, according to our experts. So that book's coming out with Oxford University Press next year, but again, you can pull down some of the results from our website. That's a separate project. So we've measured some of the questions and identified some of the weaknesses and some of the strengths. So then we also are looking not just at across countries, but we're starting to look at within country. Now this is very preliminary. It's results based on the September regional elections in those governors' areas and local legislatures where there were elections. And we haven't yet completed the survey. So I'm not going to analyse it, I'm not going to present any more details, but this just gives a little snapshot of the overall picture right now. And again, I'd say to you, if you were to look at these results, which again are in the kind of traffic light convention, so it's easily read, does it make sense, just as an initial look at how the elections, the quality of the elections were? And we used exactly the same questions, remember, with 40 experts in each of the different provinces. It does make sense? And I'm not a Russian specialist, I would claim to know anything about this, but for those who live here and for those, it makes sense. And maybe you can explain why some are quite so bad and some seem pretty good. And we work always in our subnationals with subnational teams of scholars. So we've got people in India, we've got teams in Venezuela, we've got teams in Russia, and they're the ones who will do the analysis. We are collecting the data on their behalf using our standardized methods. They give us the experts, and we then run the analysis through. So I think I'd love to hear your views about why you think some of the regions were stronger and weaker, but maybe we can do that in the Q&A at the end. So why would elections fail? And again, before I go on to give you some of the arguments, I'd like you just to give me 4 or 5 explanations. Why might it be that you get this variation across the world, and that you get these variations across regions, and that you get these variations within countries? Give me 3 or 4 explanations that you think would be really important to explain what's going on here. Yes, please.
Well, the first one is that the audience, the people who kind of want to choose anybody, they're not ready to understand what politician is worth to vote for. So the problem is, for example, in Russia, I know that lots of people are really, they do not really understand how to understand who is kind of trying to tell the truth or who is not. So this is a big problem of education, of political education.
Civic awareness. And of course, it's not just in Russia. We have Trump, we have Ben Carson. I mean, you've been seeing the basic problems in American primary debates right now, right? We have another one on Tuesday. And they're just promising anything and everything. It's just like, you know, the pigs will fly and we'll give you this, we'll give you that. And nobody's being critical at present of the candidates. Now, they're not taking it seriously in a way, but they're going to have to be serious in a bit. But basically, it could be a problem of lack of awareness of the candidates or the policies. And that could be particularly a problem in countries where it's not a very programmatic contest, where you're voting for people and personalities, but not really for what they stand for or what their party collectively has as their manifesto. So civic education and in some ways culture and awareness could be one issue that we can think about, and how would you test that? Give us another explanation, please.
Maybe I will be wrong, but then how elites have said, how the rulers, the government doesn't actually want to act like they are acting in democracy, or as the autocrats. Because if you take a look at Mongolia, take a look at Mongolia case. As elites of Mongolia, they really they wanted to establish democracy in their country. And if you take a look at Russia's elites, Russia's or Belarus elites, they just didn't have such a desire. So
yes. So there's 2 ways of thinking about that. One is the political will of the elites. What are their primary goals? What's their intentions? Do they intend to manipulate the election? But of course, it's very difficult to establish that with any evidence. We can certainly make rational choice models, assuming that they want to stay in power, but actually knowing what their motivation and intention is very difficult. Or it could be about the mass public is not committed to democracy. There isn't an adherence to the values or the norms, or there's disillusionment with how they see democracy performing. So it could be, again, a cultural argument that's going on here about whether people are really committed to effective competition, honest elections, universal franchise, opportunities for minorities, etc., etc. So a cultural explanation, education explanation. Give me a third, please.
I think political culture has a meaning. For example, in countries where was a one-party model and there was not opposition, and when the one-party regime stopped to exist, the opposition can't say about itself, and people just don't know about it, and they keep voting for the elites who had power, and they still have power.
Yes, so it's about, again, a one-party norm, if you like. That's what they think. On the other hand, you have to remember that if we go through the list of the Central and Eastern European states, which were all party within the Communist Party, tremendous variation there, right the way from Central Asia through to the Baltic states, etc. So it might be that it's not a fixed aspect. There might be certain norms, but it might be that it can be varied or can reflect the institutions or the choices that people have. So is it about the public culture and what they expect, or is it about what choices they're given? So that's a question that we might want to think about as well. Give me a fourth explanation, please.
I think that maybe it's the problem of electoral systems, which is not appropriate for the country, or certainly looking at it. Because, if we are choosing the proportional electoral system, and the country has a lot of some ethnic groups, yes, it will be appropriate system. But if we will choose the majority system for this country, there could be some problems in choosing the rulers.
Yeah.
So this is the problem.
So your proposition would be to test that with PR elections, you'd have high levels of election integrity, and that is exactly what I actually find. So it does seem to have an important aspect because it's more inclusive and provides checks and balances and things like that, and also provides more trust in the electoral system because everybody has a better stake. The thresholds are much lower. But follow on from that, might it be just the electoral system, or might other institutional aspects also be important for electoral integrity?
Well, the point of election is to legitimize and legalize authority. So I couldn't say that elections fail when there is a proportional majority system. Elections fail when there are battles begin.
Fights,
yeah,
contest or conflict.
Yeah, context. So I assume the point is to provide honest elections, not to provide meanings for honest elections.
And so again, if we just press that a little further, if we're in a country which is emerging from a long civil war, 30 years, and think about Democratic Republic of Congo, suddenly trying to have an election in 2006 after bloodshed that was the worst in the whole of Africa, then that's going to be such a fragile state that you're likely to just continue to have essentially elections with violence and with certain areas you can't get into, warlords prevailing, etc. So a history of conflict might be an important predictor to whether elections are going to be stable, whether people are going to accept the results, or whether there's going to be violence, which immediately delegitimizes the contest. And that's a good testable proposition that we can have. Edouard, you had a thought that you wanted to...
Speaking of Russia's regional variation, there was a book published a while ago that emphasized the role of economic factors as the initial conditions in those provinces of Russia where the regional economy was dominated by a single industry. Those people who controlled the industry basically ran an authoritarian political system, whereas in those regions where there were several power centers, there was some competition, and as a result, something more resembling of a democracy.
Yes. And again, the evidence I can test, I can look at, for example, in particular, the distribution of rents from natural resources, the oil curse, and that's a very, very strong predictor, which is very robust across the world about the quality of the elections. State capture means corruption, means that there's very little opportunities for the opposition to get the jobs, etc., etc. So natural resources are really important. What else about economic factors might be important for whether or not elections manage to work or not? Beyond natural resources, what else could be important?
Well,
yes.
There is a so-called problem of administrative resources
Yes.
that kind of some parties really use. And when we have lots of monopolies in economic sense, I mean, different companies that are monopoly in different spheres of economy. So they can make somebody vote for some party that gives them money. I mean, the government that is very cool for that economic company.
Right.
So this is a problem of administrative corruption.
Yes.
But this is more about corruption, not about elections that fail.
That's right. So if I keep out, I can into my models, I can put in natural resources, rents, and that's a good predictor. Or I can put in levels of economic corruption, which are measured through things like TI. Either one of those works, and they're very strong predictors of the quality of the election. It's not surprising. Electoral integrity, after all, is closely related to other forms of integrity. It's about transparency and things being a level playing field. So the two things do go together hand in hand. And of course, the other factor about economics is clearly in many countries, if you're very poor, if you're in a country like Afghanistan and you have very little infrastructure, then of course it's going to be more difficult logistically to run elections. Elections are very expensive. It's been estimated that some of the elections cost 128 million just to run 2004 election in Afghanistan. In large countries, in countries with very little local government structure, very little public administration, obviously levels of development might be a fundamental problem for how elections work. Any other pressing explanations you want to suggest, please?
I guess, like, if you let democracy flourish, that's one thing. I come from Pakistan, and like for last 60 years, what happens is like there are two parties. So like that's another problem. Like there are not that many options for the people to vote. But a party comes into power, and then the military, they come. There's a military coup. They rule for 10 years. Everything is gone, and then like there is kind of a referendum. They again try to like they go for elections. The other party comes in, and then there's another coup. And that it's the same thing going on. And like the last government we had that ran for like 5 years, that was like they completed their term for the first time in 60 years. So I think like if you have if your social institutions and the social infrastructure you have in place, if that's strong, that can help. But then like if you have other factors like military intervening in politics, and I guess this maybe not true for a lot of countries, but I guess apart from Pakistan, it can be true for some other countries as well, but maybe that many.
Yes. And think about two cases right now. So Egypt, and for all the problems of the Muslim Brotherhood, nevertheless, the election, people said, was at least competitive and relatively open before the military stood in with General Sisi and had a military coup d'etat, which the Americans, of course, refused to call a coup d'etat. But that totally destabilized the country. And even though there's going to be new elections there for the parliament, it's a rubber stamp institution, and it's gone back to being basically what it was under Mubarak. And the similar, now a more positive case, of course, is right now is Myanmar, where we can see again that the elections just happened, lots of people turned out, and about 70 to 80%, depending on the estimates, we haven't yet had the official release, goes to Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National Democratic Party, which is going to provide the opposition. Nevertheless, the military has 25% of the seats in the parliament, and they're there because of the constitution. And the military leader has said, yes, well, we'll congratulate Aung San Suu Kyi, but they are the power behind the throne. So we'll have to see whether or not there are genuine concessions in Myanmar, because they do need to get trade, they need to have openness, and there are various carrots to get them to open up, or whether there'll be a backlash. And of course, the election has also created some violence, in particular amongst minorities and certain populations, the Muslim population. So it's created some tensions as well. And in that context in particular, it's quite easy for the military to step in and say, look, all this democracy, in fact, created problems for us. We need to go back to security, stability, and we can provide it. So the role of the military is very important, and is also critical in Libya, critical in Tunisia, how they reacted to those revolutionary changes, which side they backed. And you only need to look at Syria right now to know if you can keep hold of your military, then clearly you can basically go on and on and on. If you lose control because the military starts to back the opposition, then you can have an electoral revolution or radical change or an uprising that can be very effective. So the military is really an important aspect of whether or not the election gets a chance to work or whether it's undermined by the army. Well, let me give you 3 more explanations. And they're all explanations which take account of a number of these issues. So this is the core model for the book. And it does have the things you've mentioned, but it also has some things you haven't mentioned too much. So we'll try to explain electoral integrity. So that's my 100-point index, is my dependent variable. The first factor are what you term fixed structural conditions. This is basic sociology 101. So it has to be levels of economic development. Has to be levels of natural resources, ethnic heterogeneity, patterns of past conflict, geographic size, population size. In other words, if you're trying to have an election in, say, Ghana, and you're trying to have it in Benin, or you're trying to have it in Nigeria, or you're trying to have it in Afghanistan, you've got fixed conditions which just make it so much more risky in some contexts rather than others. Still means we're going to have an election. Still means the international community is going to try and work in those countries, but we're often putting the most resources into the riskiest contexts. So those fixed conditions might be one driver for whether the election works. International forces is another, and this is essentially the role of the international community. Nowadays, about 1/10 of all official development aid goes in the field of democratic governance. It's been in a major increase, as I'll demonstrate, but more and more resources are going into that, including about $500 million a year on elections. Right now, the UN is assisting 60 countries a year with various aspects of elections, and many other agencies are. So it could be where the international forces are providing technical assistance, providing help, providing resources. That might be where an election works. If they step back, then it might be more problematic. So both of those could affect electoral integrity, and that's another chapter. I'll give you some results from that. Or, and this touches on the PR, it could be a variety of forms of power sharing, and this goes back to Leiphart. So it's not just whether or not there's a PR or majoritarian system, but is it presidential, is it parliamentary, are there many, many parties, are there only a few parties, and are there checks and balances through the independent judiciary, because all of those factors should limit the capacity of the executive to manipulate the election, should limit the capacity of the incumbents to be able to manipulate their own return, and should build trust in the system, which should lead more give and take. And the final factor in this book is election management. We mentioned electoral administration, but it's a hidden area which we often don't think about. But basically elections can go wrong as much because of governance problems as because of human rights and democracy problems. So if a polling station doesn't open, or the electoral register has inaccurate figures, inaccurate names on it, or there's no security of the ballot boxes, 1,001 reasons the elections can go wrong. And in many countries, election management bodies are the key agencies implementing elections. So in weak states, where the government is ineffective, it's likely the election is going to have problems as well. So all different chapters which might look at this, and I'll just give you a little taste of the evidence, and then we can open it up for the Q&A again. So all of these have a roll, the little arrows go back and forth, and then those arrows go back, where the election works, you get more, well, anyway, all of those things. So, what's the propositions? What can be tested? So as with the explanations you've given me, some of those can be operationalised quite easily. Some of those are more difficult to operationalise and to measure. But there's a number of different scholars who've been looking at this, and they say essentially in the international field, it's the carrots and sticks that we try to use to make sure that an election works. So here's the propositions. If a country is more exposed to cosmopolitan communications, meaning is it part of the global community, does it get information from around the world, then you're more likely to respect international norms for elections. If you're cut off, then that's not going to affect you so much. So for me, one of the classic ways of thinking about that is West and East Germany, and the way that so many in the East got the messages and the television signals and the radio from the West, and that I did think influenced some of the changes in that country. Technical assistance is how much we're spending on governance capacity and how much we're investing in elections. We've got some figures on that. And then electoral observers, when international observers come into a country, that should increase the transparency. You can think of these as long, medium and short-term forces. So let's test these. Firstly, globalization. We've got some good figures from the KOF Institute based in Switzerland. Every year they measure economic, social and political globalization. If you haven't looked at them, you should, it's great. So they have things like social globalization is how many McDonald's do you have in a country? Political globalization is things like which international organization does the country belong to, and so on. As you can see, globalization has expanded ever since the beginning of the third wave of democracy, but it really went up a lot in the 1990s. So the first proposition, those which are most globalized will have the most adherence to global norms of international integrity. Aid spending is a second proposition, And this we can measure. We have a very good database, which is quite new, known as aid data, and it measures official development assistance. The money which bilaterals give to countries, it's only one source of development aid, but it's an important source. And we can measure what goes on across the years from the 70s again. And as you can see, the money which is being spent on government and civil society was pretty minimal throughout the 70s, throughout the 80s. Suddenly, 2000, an enormous increase. Just as a little parenthesis, what was going on then? Why should the amount of money being spent on government as official development aid in constant millions suddenly go up in around 2000?
Maybe it was 9.
But the world hadn't been spending money on this. They'd been spending on agriculture, on HIV, on housing, on clean water, on lots of other things. Why was there a revolution which suddenly meant that government became the subject of the money that was being spent? There's a couple of things that went into this. What was going on at the world? Yeah, please.
Can it be the scandal with presidential elections in the United States, and another factor that can be true? Well, about presidential elections in the United States, it became clear that even rich democracies are not that successful at
that's interesting.
having really good and integer elections. And another thought that came to my mind is about terrorists and the idea that some bad institutions, some poor institutions in third world countries may contribute to the strength of terrorist forces all around the world.
So 9/11 in America, people made the connection then, and in the words of the administration, that democracy was not just America's values, it was America's interests, because if you had more democratic countries, you had a democratic peace, which was really about actually conflict between countries, but nevertheless, the idea was you create more stable states. So that was going on. What was going on in the World Bank that might also mean there was a sudden push on government and civil society?
Yugoslavia, maybe.
Say again?
Yugoslavia, maybe.
No, I don't think that was... Well, partly the opening up, obviously, the fall of the Berlin Wall and those changes, but those are much earlier than the actual change in the amount of money. Obviously, the timing doesn't quite fit that explanation, although there could be a lagged effect from that. But what was going on in the bank in the mid-90s that might lead to this? The focus on corruption. Remember, that was when Wolfensohn made a big emphasis, and the bank before hadn't been that focused on public administration and governance. It was again focused on basic development aid, on things like agriculture and so on. Then Wolfensohn said, if we don't have a partner, a governance, who can actually deliver aid, then we're never going to get anything to work. So then the World Bank came on board, and so democracy came on board with some, and then government. Anyway, this is a bit of an aside, I apologise. But the amount of money suddenly shot up. So 20 billion is being spent on government and civil society, with a big jump. And international observers also went up. So this is the period of the 1940s right through to more recent period. It's from NELDA, a very good data set. And again, there weren't many elections which had observers in the 40s, 50s and 60s. The UN occasionally sent observers, but that was quite exceptional. What happened, as you can see, is it suddenly shot up around the period of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then it went up to become the norm around the world. And it's really interesting about why that happened, but that's another little aside I won't bother you with right now. So all three factors could affect the quality of elections. So let's test this. So here we come with some regression models. Okay. So first what we do is we're doing this only at one level. We're doing this at the level of the country. PEI is my dependent variable. And first I put in my model the economic factors, the two which are most basic. Economic development and natural resources. Both of those highly significant, explaining quite a lot of the variation in PEI without doing anything else. Second model, let's put in globalization. And what turns out is that corruption and natural resources are still absolutely important, but that both the index of globalization, how much a country is part of the international community, and your regional levels of electoral integrity, neighbourhood effects, are really important about the quality of the election in each country. In other words, if you live, for example, in the southern cone of Africa, if you're Lesotho or Botswana, you're likely to be influenced by democracy in South Africa. If you live in Latin America, you're likely to be influenced by all the developments in elections in that region. If you live in Asia, it depends which country you're closest to. But regional effects, and particularly think about those countries in Central and Eastern Europe which have scored really well. One of the key drivers for that was the incentive to join the European Union. If those elections were seen as higher quality, that automatically led to a better prospect for membership. So regional effects are important and globalization is important. That's where the good news is. The bad news, the amount of money being spent on aid has no effect whatever on the quality of elections. And I've tried various ways of measuring this. I tried it with different lags, I tried it with different measures, I looked at how much was being spent on election, how much was being spent on democratic participation, and I couldn't get it to be significant. And this says that the amount we're investing is not, in a way, producing the goods. But there's a very good reason for that. What comes to mind? Why might it be that the amount we're spending doesn't seem to be associated? There's no correlation with the quality of the election. Yeah?
Maybe corruption.
No, because I'm kind of controlling for that with my natural resources. So I've got that already. And by the way, if I put corruption instead of natural resources, that's significant, right? So that, I don't think, is quite the reason. It's not that the money is going into people's pockets per se. The money is being spent. It's not associated, it's not correlated with the quality of the election. Why? Yes?
Maybe the reason is because some governments some governments which receive this aid are not interested in democracy. They are interested in the aid itself, and they may, for example, do what they have always been doing with elections in order to get some more aid, in order to just to prosper.
So that could be it. I'm going to give you another explanation, which is basically the international community spends the most on the riskiest elections. So which is the most expensive election where most international aid has gone in? Afghanistan. And it's not because anybody thinks that it's going to work. They don't. They just know that the problems of trying to run elections are so difficult. It's an incredibly expensive task. And in order to try and get some stable regime, governance partner that the international community can work with, they have to have elections. Similarly, Democratic Republic of Congo. So they don't put the money into the Ghanas or the Benins of the world. They put it into the most troubling. So it's a selection effect about where we have to put our international resources, and you can't do anything about that. I'm not saying it's necessarily ineffective, but we can't measure it at aggregate level, at country level. What we have to do is go to a program and then look at how far the program is having its impact or not. But you can't do it at the cross-country level. I'll show you a graph just to show you that in a minute. And then electoral observer missions at national level also make no difference whatever. So the bottom line is that on the international factors, this is what the economy looks like. This is GDP per capita, and this is the index of electoral integrity. And quite simply, it's a stepped effect. You know Tversky's argument that democracy is not a linear pattern, it's a step shift. It seems to be the case for elections as well. So you've got countries which are poor, which do have bad elections, but once you get past a certain minimal level of per capita GDP, around 15,000, then the elections seem to work. And so they're just as good as Lithuania as they are in Austria or the Netherlands, or Norway is just as good as the Korean Republic, etc. So you need a certain amount of money to run an election, essentially, because that gives you the infrastructure, the literacy, the administration and so on, but it doesn't mean to say the more money you get, the better your elections get. Natural resources, the curse, is a consistent pattern, but of course you've got outliers. Good old Norway comes out top on everything. And of course it's an outlier on this as well, with all of its resources. But by and large, the more you have oil and gas as your dependent economy, the worse your elections are going to be. It just corrupts. Globalization goes up, is positive. The more globalized you are, then the more your elections are probably going to work. The more you're cut off, then the less so. And this is the aid spending. This explains why we've got a tremendous amount of aid spending on the countries on that side, But as you can see, there's no relationship, there's no linear link between the amount we're spending and the quality of elections. So the conclusions, just to wrap up. This is the summary of the empirical evidence just from this chapter. Globalization does make a difference. Your region makes a difference, either positively or negatively. If you're next to China, you're going to have problems. If you're next to the European Union, you're more likely to have elections that work. Aid spending is not a significant predictor, but it doesn't mean to say it's ineffective. We need to test that through other mechanisms and other means. And the stock of electoral observer missions is not significant at aggregate level, but again, and that could be a selection bias. We don't send observer missions to the elections that work. We send elections to the cases we think are going to be a problem. So what do we do? Well, this is where I'm at, and this is where I'm struggling. This is where I'm working with many different international partners to say, we've got lots of things we can try to do to improve elections, but basically the bottom line, we do not have a clue about what works. And I put that quite strongly, because I've been talking to everybody from, last week I was at the UN with the Electoral Assistance Division, with IFIS, International IDEA, USAID, NDI. I've talked to basically so many different organizations involved in this area, and you say to them, have you got any evidence? You're doing all of these, for example, workshops. Every time we talk about gender equality in the elected office, what do we do? We have a workshop for women. Do they work? Can you give me some evidence? Or we're training up the electoral management bodies, or we're bringing in new regulations for campaign finance, or we're trying to improve the process of adjudication. Do they work? And we don't know. So what we need to do, I think, as a general area, and again this is an area for future research if you're thinking about PhD research, is really think about other methods to try and get at impact effectiveness in the field of elections and democratic governance. And what that really means is experimental methods, amongst other things. Going to a particular project in a particular country, having a very good randomization, working out what you're trying to do but trying different treatments, and then looking through your controls to the changes, a pre and post test. Does it actually make a difference? If you go to one of these workshops trying to improve your competencies as a woman candidate, does it mean you're more effective? Does it mean you've gained skills? Does it mean you're more confident? Does it mean your career is going to be different in politics? Nobody's done it yet much. They've done a little bit at the mass level with civic education and civic awareness, but that's very sporadic. And everywhere else in development aid is going towards randomized controlled trials. It does mean you're limited in what you can say about each one, but the more we can do, the more we can have a meta-analysis across different studies, the more we can build up an effective picture, the more we can say which of these different areas is really the one that we should be invested in, which should be our strategic priorities. If we're concerned about the quality of elections, if we think we need to improve them, we actually need better evidence-based research about what we're doing. We've been doing this for 25 years now, and we're just asleep at the wheel. We're just doing the same old, same old. And I'm telling everybody we need to do aid effectiveness. Whether we do is another matter. Anyway, we're doing other reports which I won't talk about. This is my team, etc., or some of my team. Everything's up there. Go to the electoralintegrityproject.com and you'll find everything that you ever wanted to know about our project, and you can download it all. Q&A, further thoughts, further questions?
Thank you very much. You seem to manage the audience wonderfully, so perhaps you want to manage the Q&A session?
Q&A, whatever. So, questions, comments, criticisms? I did, please.
I have a question regarding the mechanics of PEA. Doesn't matter. Anyway, so if we are talking about experts, are they internal or external? And I have this question regarding North Korea. How do you, well, if they're internal, how do you ask experts from North Korea, for example? And what is more, what do you assume is the best number of experts on the country when they are, well, putting these indexes and their marks? And for example, if you have only 2 experts from a country, would you regard this country as research in this country as complete?
Okay, good question. So, with any measure, as you know, what you want is a number of criteria, one of which is internal validity. So what we do is we do some regression models at the expert level. We release our data set at the level of the experts, the individuals, at the level of the election, at the level of the country. So with the experts, you want to know, how do they get these perceptions? Does it matter how familiar you are with the election, what your political views are? Are you a national or are you an international? How long have you lived in that country, etc. So we test all of those factors and we look about whether it makes a difference on your perception index. And the answer is quite simply very little. Apparently, which I can't understand, women and men do differ slightly. I'm not sure why. That's one of the very few demographic factors which seems to come out. But fortunately, your political ideology, left-right, doesn't make a difference. It does make a difference if you supported the government, the party that won, but that's a universal thing, the winner-loser thesis, we know that. So the internal validity is pretty robust. Then we've got the external validity. So we test, is the PEI index correlated with 3 or 4 other indices which are somewhat similar? And they all come out pretty good. So even though we've got slightly different time periods and different measures, and each one has been done by different colleagues, if there's a correlation, it means that we're all judging roughly the same thing. But they're not identical, so it shouldn't be a perfect correlation. And so, for example, the Freedom House or the polity, you can say, is that correlated with PEI? It is. On the other hand, with Freedom House, they only have some aspects of elections and you can't really look at it in any detail. So then you can look at PEI and break it down by all the different individual aspects that we look at. So we're asking in every country 40 people, which is bigger than many expert surveys, which go, VDEM asks 5, which I think is ridiculous. But there are different methods of doing expert surveys. And we only get 30% on average, but some countries we get much more respondents. The Dutch, for example, they love to fill out questionnaires. In some countries it's very difficult to find enough experts, particularly where there isn't a tradition of elections, because people haven't been trained. So we always publish our confidence intervals at the back of our report. And that allows you to see not only the number of respondents who've come from each country, but the variation that we would expect statistically given the number of respondents. And that's the margins. And quite simply, where you've got 2 countries in the list which are very close. So you look at the difference here between, say, Lesotho, South Africa, Namibia, 3 points, obviously there's no difference. When you're talking about a 40-point, 20-point, 10-point gap, then you've got a greater chance that it's not just accident which is generating that. So we do work on this. And I should add, we're going to have a special APSA. We've got a workshop coming up just before the American Political Science Association, and the theme of it is the methods of expert surveys. And the reason is everybody's making it up between ourselves. There is no method. With normal surveys, we have all sorts of things, standards of practice, codes of conduct, how you should sample, how you should be transparent about your methods. When it comes to the experts, everybody's doing it. Nobody's giving us any methods or even codes. So I think we need to do it better. And I hope at the end of the workshop we'll have hammered out some basic principles that maybe every expert survey should say they want to adhere to, just like you have one for market research. I think that would be a very good thing to do. But again, I don't believe, for example, between ourselves, a lot of VDEM's methods. I think their questions are too complicated. I think they ask too many issues. 400 questions, and they ask it right back from 1900 to 2012. I can't answer that myself for the countries I know, so I don't know how the experts can. I do think ours are more credible, but you know, everything can be improved if we look about the human rights indicators, the democracy indicators, the indicators which are there for corruption, all of the ones we use all the time. We need to hammer it out a bit more clearly.
We also have an audience in St. Petersburg, and I wonder if there are questions from there.
Or observations.
Observations.
Maybe he was expecting that.
I have a question. Talking about the regions. Maybe the quality of elections in regions can be explained with the theory of Tato Vanhanen, which tells us that the distribution of power and the equality of economic in countries can result in democracy or autocracy. So, for example, in a rich region where there is only one big company, we can see autocratic elections, and on the other hand, in poor regions, but with big diversity, we can see good elections. Maybe like this, maybe it can work.
Yes, and I hope that you might want to look at that research and really look at the results when we finish the results in Russia. And one could do this at the subnational level to really say, is that what's explaining this particular pattern? And again, I'm not the person who's going to be doing that analysis. We're collecting the data on behalf of scholars who'd like to look at this. But I think that could be a plausible thing you might want to look at, along with patterns of party competition, along with a range of other factors that might explain some of these patterns, which really are fascinating in the variations which you can see. Yes.
I have a question about disputed territories and how the quality of elections in some disputed territories are measured on subnational level, because you know that Russia has some territories which are not world recognized, as well as India, which are the objects of your subnational research. So what is the approach to this problem?
So this survey in Russia was done with 30 regions, and again, I didn't select them, the experts who are running this group did. So they include the ethnic republics and the autonomous districts, and they basically found 40 experts in each of these areas, which they thought could be run. And we're still getting the results back, so we haven't yet finished, so don't think this is definitive, or that the response rate is yet finished, etc. But clearly, again, I think it's important. It's also important to cover countries which are going to become independent nation states. Think about Bulgaria, which is going for independence. Think about the issues in Spain right now. So when you've got those particular areas, Catalonia in particular, pushing for these sorts of things, then you need to do this. In Britain, by the way, we did it for Scotland and England and Wales, because again, Scotland might be doing its own thing any minute now, going off for another vote on independence. And again, if we've done this beforehand, we can see what the dynamics are for before and after.
I expect there's no some obvious correlation, but can we say that the increasing of paying attention to governmental elections in 2000 further could lead to some kind of new wave of democratization?
But we're in a depression, right? We're in a recession right now. So everybody says basically what's happening. Well, you know Huntington, if you go back to Huntington, which I hate to say, but nevertheless, he always said there were waves of democratization. And whilst everybody pushes back on his measures, I think there is cycles, certainly. And since 2005, you can either see stability or you can see decline. Decline is there in a number of indicators, not so much in the Freedom House, which is more or less just stable, but in the pushback on human rights, in the pushback on NGOs and independent civil society, in the way in which a number of authoritarian regimes are being more assertive than they were in the past to try and deter democracy promotion. So, and also in the checkered history, of course, of the Arab uprisings, where, again, Tunisia is a miraculous success in some ways, but still has problems, but every other country, of course, has turned into chaos. And we haven't yet monitored in the World Values Survey whether this is going to have a tremendous impact on the public and the public's belief and support for democracy. There's a little bit of evidence that that might be on the decline, but we won't know, I think, until the 7th wave. It's too early in the last wave, which was finishing in 2005. But we've got to monitor very clearly all of those different dimensions of support. So democracy is an ideal. Has that become tarnished now? Or do people still think it's an ideal, but it's the performance of democracy, which they thought was going to work, but actually has produced instability and challenged their values? Or is it basically just more the performance of the authorities and the governments and the politicians which they're electing? We don't know to what extent, to use the French analogy, the fish rots from the head down, but we don't know what the depth of the depression or recession is in the public's view. But I think there is good evidence now, credible evidence, that the world is not advancing in democratization by any shape or form. And again, you can see some good points like Burma, Myanmar, but you can also see many other points going backwards, fragile states that started on the democratization path, but then have obviously collapsed again. It's a very 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of process, as I don't need to tell you at all in this country. So that's a new area. And there's a new issue, for example, of the European Journal of Political Research about how this is happening and the reassertion of authoritarian regimes in challenging the hegemonic norms of democracy. And again, at the UN, all of the agencies I'm talking to are talking about a contraction in their budgets, are talking about having to justify their work much more than they ever had to in the heady period of the early 90s. In the early 90s, everybody thought it was just this wave. You remember it was the end of history, Fukuyama. It was this sense that it was a progress and it was all going to get better and better in the best of all possible worlds. Well, we know that's not true. And that's been partly heavily coloured, I think, by, in America, Iraq and Afghanistan. It's also being coloured by the weakness of America, which is no longer as aggressive, or let's put it this way. America has two cycles. One is interventionist and one is isolationist. And then some of it's to do with national security interests and some of it is to do with humanitarian interests. And right now we're into an isolationist phase, as America's got so tired of the wars and felt that they've really got nowhere. And that this attempt to strengthen democracy, whilst ideals are certainly there, in practice is so difficult that things are going backwards in that culture. And of course America is less credible as a model because of the politics of America. It's just stalemate, it's just broken in so many different ways. So it's going to take some time for the international community to catch up on these developments. It's a slow-moving train. It's like turning around an oil ship. But I think it is turning. There's evidence for that, and we'll have to see how the next World Value Survey, whether it picks up on that. All of this I didn't mention, by the way. We can also look at the elites and the public. So we've got the same questions in the world values as we have in the PEI. Some of them are the same. And there's quite a strong correlation across those two. So that's another way of thinking about what the evidence is. The public and the experts are more or less in agreement about many of the different issues. In Ukraine, for example, there was criticism on both for the equality of the election, and in some other countries they were positive on both. Other thoughts? Criticism? Anybody who hasn't yet had a chance to say anything? Any other thoughts about the final thing about what needs to be done to strengthen elections? I.e., what would you recommend to do? What's the actions that could be taken?
I assume it's more about working with elites, rather than working with the system itself. I mean, if elites want to change, then they change electoral system. If they don't want to, it would never happen. Maybe it could help with national oppression.
So, when we talk about elites, that's a big category. What do we mean?
We mean, well, economic elites, firstly, well, oligarchs, for example. Political elites, like ruling clans in the country. And, well, that's what I mean, yeah. And bureaucratic elites maybe, yes.
So then you might want again to think about the carrots and sticks, the incentives, and also think about the cases which have changed dramatically and successfully in a fairly short time. And again, you know, we can't assume it's a 100 years process. It isn't necessarily in a number of countries which have moved within our lifetimes towards a very effective government opposition, give and take, effective parliaments, checks and balances, judiciaries become more independent, public participates, satisfaction is reasonable and so on. Is it simply a matter of the political will of the elites, or can that be shaped by the incentives within which they work? Both the diplomatic and international incentives, the diplomatic and international carrots and sticks, but also the structure of institutions, the way in which they're designed, the way in which the constitution is framed. When a country is in a transition process, how can we actually strengthen the processes of elections and democracy at that interval as well? Because political will sounds plausible, but what does it mean? How do you nail it down? How do you change it? It's kind of a catch-all excuse. And how do you measure it? Very, very difficult to do. Yeah.
It does seem to matter because, for instance, when I think about Eastern Europe, it's split along more or less the Soviet border,
Yeah.
because the elites to the west of the border had a clear prospect of being integrated into the European elites, and then also the generally international elites, whereas the elites to the east of the border never had the prospect. They tried for a while, and maybe they had an illusion, and then the process really stopped.
Yeah, and as we know in Ukraine, it divided everything. So that's the big diplomatic carrot. Membership of, also think about other countries, think about membership of trade organisations, obviously in China, think about membership of international markets. There are carrots out there which can be really important, even if it's not a membership of a regional association. Countries do want to be respected, they do want to be part of the international community, they want to be respected within the United Nations as well. And then there are sticks like trade sanctions or aid conditionality or a variety of other mechanisms that the international community can do. But essentially, unless there's domestic buy-in, unless there's also a way in which that country is wanting to have that change, then the international pressures themselves won't be effective. If, however, there is globalization, so there's enough opposition groups who are wanting to push for this, there's enough reform organizations, there's enough ordinary people who are committed to democracy. And if one looks at public opinion, certainly it does seem that most people in most countries, at least in the past, said, yes, they did want democracy versus most of the alternatives. If those conditions are there, and you also get the element of happenstance and luck, so there's an election, for example, in Malaysia, and it just tips, or Singapore, it just tips towards the opposition, just slightly, and then suddenly there's actually an effective opposition party that can really come back into power, and not a pushback from the incumbents. Then you can change the dynamics of the process in those countries. And often what causes that transition is, in my view, very happenstance-ish. We're not really very good at theorising about that. Why you get that opportunity for change. Nobody predicted, remember, the Arab uprisings at the time. Everybody who was writing in the region said, these are authoritarian states and they'll persist. People like Eva Berlin, who was very good at explaining why these states were authoritarian. And then suddenly, the contagion effect. And nobody expected Gaddafi to fall, nobody expected Egypt to change, and Mubarak to be pulled down, let alone Ben Ali in Tunisia. And of course, each one affected each other country, so there was a domino effect going on, and things opened up, positively and negatively, positively in the beginning and then negatively towards the end, in Syria and Bahrain. So these things happen, and then once you get, it's like a window of opportunity, once you get that transition starting, sometimes as a result of grassroots mobilisation, the colour revolutions, I'd argue, were about grassroots and the public, not about elites necessarily. Then you get an opportunity, and then the question is, where do you go? And many countries are going through these constitutional changes. In my class at Harvard, we're just talking about a range of different countries which are doing this, such as Nepal, such as South Sudan, which are thinking about the new constitutional arrangements. And if you can get the right institutions in place, the most appropriate institutions for that context, then you can create different incentives at a domestic level for the elites. Different ways in which they can win through that electoral system, or divide power in the parliament, or organise opposition parties, etc. So that's when the institutions really matter. And then it's how individuals work within those institutions. Do they respect them, or do they try and overthrow them? So I don't think it's simply leadership. Obviously, we all think, if only everybody had Mandela, wouldn't it be great? But we don't have Mandelas to go around the world. But we do know something about constitutional engineering. We do know something about transitions. We do know something about international pressures. When you put all those things together, you can have some successful cases and others which are falling back. And all the international communities can do is try and push at the edges. So when there's an opening, like in Myanmar, everybody goes in, all the international aid agencies, to try and strengthen it. If that works, that'll be great. If it doesn't, happenstance will, interact again and things will fall apart.
Okay, maybe a couple more questions, and you've had your chance, so maybe that lady.
From my point of view, it's very important to have civil society in the country.
Yeah.
For example, if we are talking about Russia, you remember 2011 when here some protests started after the elections, but
Yes, that's
then
right.
they were suppressed by our government.
And the Duma,
Yes.
the new law, that's right.
And nowadays we can see that people can't impress their
They can't protest, they can't be effective, they can't mobilise around the elections and protest.
yes, and what's more, it's very important to provide some structures to improve the political educational level among people, because if people are not interested in elections and in their government, there will never be some good elections in the country.
Yeah. Yes, so opportunities to protest are critical, and opportunities to mobilise, and opportunities to pressure the government. And it's very, very difficult when there are new laws against that, which restrict the power of civil society and restrict the power of the media as well to provide another channel. Against that, we have to say that there are countervailing forces. Obviously, social media is another way of connecting, increasingly for young people, and that's important, especially where, even though there's censorship, nevertheless there are many ways around those forms of censorship. And in the long term, I mean, the public is changing in terms of education, in terms of affluence, in terms of all of those characteristics, and in terms of basic values. If we go back to the kind of world values, which is part of our core area, as Inglehart always says, if one thinks about the progress in terms of economic development and the changes that makes on people's lifestyle, and the higher levels of education amongst the young people, and the rising aspirations to participate in their government, and their interest in politics in general, even if not necessarily through voting and conventional mechanisms, all of those in the long term should be moving in a more democratic direction, even if there's also unique constraints and pressures and difficulties in expressing it in a particular time. So in the long term, one hopes that these developments will lead in a more democratic direction. But in the short term, it's difficult.
You asked the question, and the question sounded like how we can change the situation with the quality of elections.
Yes.
And my basic conclusion after the results of this research, after the results of BEI research, is that the question should be different. Do we really need the situation with quality of elections to be changed? Because we can see that in North Korea the quality of elections is on a really good level, excellent mark, good. Some regions of the Russian Federation, which I consider to be more democratic, perform in a worse way. So maybe we shouldn't put so much money into countries like Afghanistan in terms of some institutions like elections, because the basic problem with Afghanistan is war and terrorists. The basic problem with North Korea is another from elections. Maybe we should more focus on some different sides of democratical institutions.
So this relates to one of my other books, which is Making Democratic Governance Work. And what that argues is that you absolutely have to have both dimensions. You have to have governance and you have to have democracy, but you can't choose between the two. Essentially, if you have governance, and so you basically go for efficiency, and you make sure that local governments can deliver services, and you make sure that they're clean and not corrupt, etc., etc. That's all critical. You have to have that state capacity. But essentially, if you don't have the elections, then you can't ever get rid of that government. They're just going to continue in power, and it will be a persistent one-party state. And so when there are problems, then the leaders aren't accountable. But you also can't just go for democracy without governance, because the problem is there, especially if you have a lot of elections in countries which have a very weak state. The politicians get elected make promises. They have to make promises, but they can't deliver those services themselves because they have very little public sector capacity, very limited resources, so immediately that can lead to disillusionment, and you can end up with fragile democracies that fall back under threats. So there are many cases like that, and indeed that's the largest category in the world. So when you put together the governance and the democracy together, you obviously get some cases which have both. So, you know, the Norways and Sweden's okay, we can take this for granted. But also cases like Chile, also cases like Latvia are also up there now, and there are many cases which have moved up and have got good quality states and good quality democracy. You've also got cases in the bottom quadrant which have neither. There's Somalia, right? A weak state but run by a few power lords without any real accountability, whatever. And there are many, many cases like that, and those are the worst cases of all. You have a few cases which have governance without democracy. Singapore is always the exception, but also China, and also a number of other countries like UAE, for their citizens certainly can give good services because they're very rich. Qatar is another case like that, always promising elections, now having them. So there's a few. The majority of cases right now around the world are actually in this case of having elections, but without a state, without governance, without capacity. So to that extent, I do sympathise that you can't just have elections and walk away. It's part of a package. And if you have an election without being able to deliver on promises, then the whole thing breaks down. But you have to have elections, and again, somebody in Harvard was just challenging me on this the other day, and I was saying, but you know, the most perfect administration, if you can't get rid of those leaders because they're corrupt or because they're not performing, then that's a failure in itself. So the two things together, you need both hands clapping, to use that kind of cliche. And then you've got effective processes. So let's work on both, not think of them that they're trade-offs, basically.
Well, very last one.
My question is about the United Kingdom. On the
They didn't do very well, by the way, on the elections, either.
I mean, on the 7th of May, there were elections.
That's right.
And they showed quite unusual results
for
the United Kingdom. Can we say that the perception of integrity level has changed there?
I'm not sure it's changed. It's just not very good. They were 30th or so on my rankings of all countries, so I was quite surprised actually how bad they did. I thought that the electoral administration was pretty good now that they've got that sorted out, but there have been a number of local scandals of insecurity. Part of the trouble is that electoral management bodies are trying to make voting more convenient, so they make registering more convenient, they make hours more convenient, but then the security can be a problem, and you can get invalid votes being cast or people being registered who aren't citizens and all those sorts of things. But the UK has far more fundamental problems right now other than elections. I mean, one is it has no Labour Party to speak of because they've gone off into their own hurry-curry. The Lib Dems are all in a taxi because there aren't many members of those, and the Conservatives are cutting back on benefits while they're saying that they're recurring Conservatives. Europe is going to divide them again, and that's coming up, and it's very unlikely it's going to be renegotiated because that's another can of worms that nobody wants to open, and Scotland wants to do its own thing. So whether or not, after all this time, we see the end of the United Kingdom, and Northern Ireland is becoming more violent as well, so that's another problem. It's not good, really. Glad I'm not living in the United Kingdom.
All right. I'm told that I had been ignoring one person who was trying to ask a question for a while, but we only have 2 minutes left for this one last question.
I would really like to know your views about how multilateral organizations influence election process. For instance, like IMF and the World Bank, when they are providing aid to third world countries, they influence their policies as well. I would like to know that, like how they influence the election process. And okay, the Arab Spring, everyone says that like it was a revolution and everything, but there are other conspiracy theories around it that like it was instigated by the US and others. So like for geostrategic political reasons, how like these superpowers, how they influence like how a party comes into the rule or how it gets elected, how they influence that part.
So the World Bank and the IMF don't work on elections, they work on governance. So they're all about corruption, public administration 101 and that side of things, but by their mandate they can't. Other agencies at the UN do that work. So the other agencies, the major players, some of the ones I've mentioned, UNDP, big player, many countries around the world, and IFIS, NDI, USAID, also Anne Frell in Asia, also various other organisations of electoral management, etc. And basically what most of these do is softly. It's working for capacity building in conjunction. The government has to invite those agencies in, and then they basically give them technical assistance. For example, if you want to have biometric technology to register your voters, which is increasingly the fashion in Africa, very expensive, Nigeria will go to UNDP and say, we need this technology to have an accurate register. They then will go to their bilateral donors, Germany, Britain, Norway, etc., and say, can you support this with a pool of money that can help that electoral administration process? So it's very softly, trying to build up these norms, but trying to build up the technical capacity to run an election is what they're doing. At the hard end of the spectrum, there are some cases certainly where bilateral actors and international actors of the G8 are trying to force more problematic changes. And there are a number of cases of that which are there as well. But it's not really about, they don't really link very much the election side to the policy side. I mean, they're not that joined up, they're not that coherent, essentially. So economic policy people do one thing, and development experts do another, and then the elections group is a different group again on that area. And by the way, it isn't it's Arab uprisings. It's not an Arab Spring because we're right here. That's whatever. Yes. And you know, everybody's learned some of those lessons as well. Was it triggered by the Americans? Absolutely not. They couldn't organise that sort of thing at all. And you saw in Egypt, I mean, basically the Americans are backing whichever government calls itself the government in Egypt. They're not backing any particular side. And I think that's actually a real failure of their commitment to human rights and a failure of the Obama administration. They should have called it a coup d'etat, and they should have cut back on 1.3 billion aid for the military, which they didn't, despite the fact it's very contrary to American policy. They didn't stand up for the revolutions in any shape or form. They did a little bit in Libya, but that was largely the French who kicked off rather than the Americans. Obama has always been a reluctant democracy promoter, unfortunately, I think. But that's partly also the legacy of Bush. I'm rambling a bit about American politics, but we're in an interesting time right now about where we go. And nobody is talking about any of this in any of the debates for the next candidates so far. Foreign policy is also a very small amount, but even so, the things which they're saying has nothing to do with all of this area.
Oh well. Well, let's thank Pippa Norris.
Thank you. Good luck with your elections as well.
Well,